Hello, friends. Mike Yao here from Savage Kingdoms role-playing game, Red Sun role-playing game, Fire and the Head Productions, etc. You can see the posters behind me. That's Savage Kingdoms. That's Red Sun. They're both the same setting. One is D20 based. One is D8 dice pool based. But they're from the same setting. They are 2,500 years apart. One's more of a Bronze to Iron Age, early Iron Age setting, and the other is more of a right in the Iron Age, a Dark Ages setting. Anyway, enough about that. And Fire the Head Productions is the my little production slash publishing company. So today's video is about, as you can probably see in the title down there, sort of tongue in cheek, why Rangers suck. But the bigger thing is about, I'm doing this because this is in quotes, and they don't actually suck. I'll tell you why in this video. Or actually, maybe they kind of do, but I'll tell you why they do and how it's easy to fix. So the greater point of this video is travel and exploration in tabletop role-playing games, particularly Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, my own game, Savage Kingdoms, Red Sun. Shout out again, whatever tabletop role-playing game there is that has to do with travel, and this would largely do with medieval fantasy, but in the greater sense, like science fiction, to be traveling across perhaps a galaxy or multiple galaxies, or landing planet side and traveling on that world sphere, that planet. So yeah, let's get right to it. So first of all, I'm going to start off. I got my little notes here. First, I'm going to get right to why Rangers suck, because most of you might have, well, of the 12 people watching this, maybe 9 of you tuned in because of that. But for you 9 people, and I've spoken to this about this for several years. I've mentioned it to some of my youth players that I run Dungeons and Dragons for, even some of my adult players. I'm like, I said I can cure the whole Ranger suck thing like in 2 moves, and they're like, why? So, and I've been at this a while too. So I like to think that I've gathered some knowledge and experience along the way. So the main reason Rangers suck is because the exploration pillar is not engaged enough in modern fantasy, modern tabletop role-playing games in general, generally speaking. Um, so there's Dungeons and Dragons has what they call 3 pillars of play, right? 3 aspects, 3 overarching themes, things, tones, if you will, aspects of a session, of a game session, or an entire campaign. That is, the first one is combat. Everybody kind of knows about that one. That's kind of, in some ways, sadly, is kind of the main one. The other one is social. And most people kind of know about that one too. Now, some people just call that the role playing pillar. I find that ridiculous because it's a role playing game, so all 3 of them are role playing. When your character is exploring or fighting, I would assume you're still more or less in character, right? Anyway, that's the idea. So social, we'll call it, which I think is more appropriate. And then there's exploration, and exploration is the one that I think in modern fantasy gets overlooked the most, unfortunately. In fact, there's a pretty well-known YouTuber. I won't say who it is because I like some of his stuff, or a lot of his stuff kind of makes sense. And maybe I don't think he's been at this quite as long, but as I have, but he has been at it for a while. Um, you said that just skip the travel and get right to from point A to point B and to skip all the in between, which I find a little ridiculous because you're cutting out the exploration pillar of the game, therefore, technically 33% of the game, 1/3 of it, and a lot of the meat of, say, the Lord of the Rings, which, a lot of the base fantasy is kind of based off of, particularly high fantasy. So travel is like, what's the old term? Uh, the travel is the destination is not as interesting as the journey, right? The journey is what it's all about. The destination is just kind of marks the end of the journey, right? And that's probably why a lot of TV shows struggle with sticking the landing, as we say. Like they'll have these cool like epic 12, 13, 26 episodes, and then the landing is kind of womp womp. And I think the reason that happens in novels too, but I think it happens more in television, is because, again, to my point, is that the middle part, that's most of the journey, right? That's where all the kind of the meat is. And the ending is just kind of the light dessert at the end. It doesn't often stick or hit very hard. I mean, I think Tolkien with Lord of the Rings managed to stick the landing pretty good, but in some ways that's kind of easy because he's the one that kind of set the bar there. Um, So anyway, my point being that the destination, that's great and all, but let's not chop out that middle part. Like, for example, let's say you're traveling from the village of Cairnia to the town of Castavar or whatever, and it's a 3 day journey. So during those 3 days, all kinds of cool things could have happened. Different random encounters. They could have experienced. They could have experienced strange weather effects or strange cosmological effects. Met some interesting travelers on the road. Maybe fought some terrible enemies that tried to rob them, slash kill them, slash eat them. All these kind of things that you expect normally from medieval fantasy, right? Or sword and sorcery fantasy or Dark Ages fantasy. Um, so yeah, we don't want to chop it out, right? And I'll show you guys how to do this because using Dungeons and Dragons is kind of the template here because it is the grandfather of all role-playing games. It is kind of the de facto king, as it were. Um, Using that as an example, so Dungeons and Dragons doesn't currently, at least in fifth edition, doesn't have a really typically good exploration travel mechanics behind the pillar of exploration, and I think that's why often it gets skipped. That, and I think because we're kind of in this TikTok generation where everything has to happen really fast, I think people just want to be like, all right, okay, we meet in the tavern and we go to the thing. And that can be fine if that's your style, and maybe you only have a few hours. I know I've had to adapt my game mastering style to that style kind of when I'm running games at like a convention where you only have like 3.5 to 4 hours slot. So you almost have to kind of cut to the chase, as it were. Um, at least to some degree. So I do get it to some degree, but if you're running a weekly game or a bi-weekly game or even a couple times a week if you're so blessed, and it's more overarching campaign or long adventure, and you're cutting to the chase every time, so to speak, you're cutting, as I said earlier, 1/3 of your game out, at least 1/3, possibly even more, maybe slightly less, just depending on your setting and your kind of your style and really what your players, what their characters are about. But yeah, so D&D Dungeons and Dragons does it currently in 5e have a particularly hard-coded game mechanic of how to handle travel. I mean, it kind of does it. It has all the rules. If they're not in the player's handbook, they're in the DM's guide for certain about thirst and starvation and foul weather, blizzards and stuff like that, and a little bit about sea travel and underwater travel, sort of a little bit, but it doesn't really give a good system. So in Savage Kingdoms fourth edition, which is my game, I'm coming up with the fourth edition hopefully next month or two. I'm working on a better, hopefully a better, at least what I think, travel system. And I've always had travel in Savage Kingdoms because that's dear to me. I wouldn't be making this video if it wasn't. Um, but I think that D&D could probably stand to use, and maybe Pathfinder 2 has a better system. I haven't really looked at that part of the game system. Almost like a systematic approach to game, to travel. So, for example, Savage Kingdoms 4th Edition, you start every day with a let's say you're leaving the village of, what did I say earlier, Cairnia or something. Although it's actually a kingdom or setting in Savage Kingdoms if you're a Savage Kingdoms person. But anyway, I just threw that name out there. And you've got the 3 day journey to Castavar, or is projected to be 3 days. That's what the lore says, or maybe those characters have actually are from there. They've been back and forth a couple times. So each day of travel in the morning, you would start with a survival roll to see, check on direction, so basically navigation, and the survival skill handles that in Savage Kingdoms as well as it does in D&D theoretically. And if you miss by 5 or more, something happens. You either get lost or you have to roll on this hazards table, which is really cool. So the hazards table has it's a d20 roll, has 20 different things that can happen. Actually, I think if you roll a 20, you can come up with your own something. I don't have it in front of me right now. Just trust me, off the top of my head. So anyway, you could roll on the hazard table. You could roll the festering dead, which is one of my favorite, where it's like you come up across a pile of bodies, corpses, or carcasses, or mix thereof, maybe from some old battle, maybe some horrible ritual. They're festering, and the characters could catch a disease if they get too close to them. And then it presents like moral quandaries of, do they put the bodies on a funeral pyre? Do they bury them? Do they just leave them to nature? Or they just do nothing and just skirt around it and try not to get any close to what is clearly a festering sort of contagion. And there's other, let's see, I have quicksand is a possibility, running into quicksand. Blizzards are possible. Now, some of this is all climate or terrain based. In other words, you're not going to find quicksand probably up in the icy tundra. Well, I mean, there are types of quicksand that do technically exist in most terrain types. But quicksand, as we know it, is usually more in a swampy area, kind of tropical to subtropical. But there are types of quicksands or quicksand-like stuff, and you can even use tar pits. A tar pit is a form of, I guess, quicksand. It does kind of the same thing. Um, Captures something and possibly pulls them down. Quicksand has the effect of course, almost pulling you down because of the watery. I don't think a tar pit necessarily does that, but tar pits would keep you stuck there for a while. It's very strong. I mean, that's why they found dinosaur bones in some of them because even some of these mighty dinosaurs couldn't escape some of the tar pits. Um, or a hunter's trap that you could come across, a pitfall trap, or an actual steel trap, mechanical trap. There's a bunch of other possibilities on there as well. You could also find wild herbs. But anyway, we're talking about a failure on the roll right now. So a failure on the starting of the day survival roll allows you to have to roll in the hazards table. Um, and there's also you can get lost. So I don't have the rules quite in front of me, but I believe if I recall, because I've been tweaking them back and forth, I admittedly keep kind of changing them over the last kind of like little versions of the playtest rules that I hand out to my playtesters and players. So I've been tweaking it back and forth. But I believe if you fail the roll by 5 or more is when you roll in the hazards table. If you fail by just 0 to 4 points on the die, then it's just you become lost, and I think it's lost for uh, I can't remember what I said, what it is. I think based on how I've created the game system, the way the mechanics go, usually if probably every point you miss is in an hour's time. I think so many hours of movement, hours of time that have gone by until you realize that you're lost. Then at midday you get to check again to see if you righted your course, or if you run into another hazard. And the DRs for this, DR is kind of the Savage Kingdom's equivalent to DC, which we know in D&D means difficulty class. In Savage Kingdoms and Red Sun, it's both known as a DR, which means difficulty rating. So basically, the same thing. It's a target number. A DR10 is something like a very obvious road that you're on, a well-known path. The characters might have even been to the place you're going to at one point. Actually, that's DR5. Sorry, uh, DR5 is considered an easy difficulty, an easy task. In Savage Kingdoms 2, you can like hand wave DR5 things if you want. So you don't even have to roll if it's something that simple. A DR10 challenge would be more of a lesser used roads, or even possibly a major road in like at night, or if the weather's really really bad, and so it would make it more difficult. DR15 is like back paths. You're using animal paths or maybe hunters paths. They're not like major trade routes or where you would move armies. Better chance of getting lost. And in terrain such as like moors and marsh and uh, forest and maybe lower mountains and hills. This might be the challenge level. Then you get up to DR20, which is things like you're cutting literally overland across mountains or across jungle without any known path. So DR20, as you would imagine, pretty challenging to do that, and quite easy to get lost. Hence, what would happen if you failed the roll? And again, if you fail the roll by 5 or more, something even worse than getting lost happens. You run into a hazard, stuff like that. Now, random encounters of creatures are not attached to this whole system yet. Well, they kind of are, but they're not part of that role. They are part of encounter checks that you make. I think it's every 4 hours in the wilderness. Um, Although I think the caveat, every 2 hours you check if you're near a settled area, and then there's a 75% chance that those encounters have to deal with the locals. So, for example, you're traveling an area that has a lot of farming villages. Most of your encounters are going to be with farmers, but there could also be bandits. Remember, bandits, brigands operate close to civilization, but far enough away to where they're not so easily captured by bounty hunters and other authorities, kingsmen and stuff like that. But they're close enough to where they can bandit off of people, right? They can pinch and mooch and that sort of thing, steal and rob and all that sort of Robin Hoody, non-Robin Hoody stuff, right? So yeah, but then the other counters would be things like what you would more traditionally be accustomed to in a fantasy tabletop game, like goblins or goblings, as they're called in the SK world, um, or the She, various types of Fae, red caps. You could run into a dragon, like 20 is dragons are really rare in SK, so only a few of the like really elder ones are left, but they still produce offspring every so often. So it is possible to encounter like a somewhat younger dragon, though they are really rare. So it's like I think you have to, I think it's on a 20 on the encounter table, and then you have to roll another subtable, and it has to be another 20, something like that. Of course, game masters, this is my advice, are free to do set encounters, what meaning that you're not rolling randomly, you have them in mind. My only caveat to that is that because you don't want to railroad the players, right? You want them to have. I'm really big into like player agency, like letting them have choice. It is a game after all. We're not just sitting down reading a novel or telling a story. We are, but there's the game stuff behind it. Like in other words, we don't know what's going to happen by the end of the session, right? Whereas a scripted story, we would theoretically, unless we're reading it for the first time. But you get the idea. So keeping that in mind, um, yeah, you don't really know what's going to happen with the random encounter stuff. So the set encounter, you have to be a little careful because it's almost like you want it to happen regardless. But my point is that give it a way around. Like if the players are smart and they maybe through a lore skill roll or maybe by a survival check of finding tracks or scat or something like that, they might get a clue that there's like a dragon or a giant or some other horrible thing that's up ahead, and they can skirt around it, therefore defeating your set encounter. So yeah, a little piece of advice, a little side piece of advice there. If you're going to use a set encounter, make sure that there's a counter to the encounter if possible, if the players are clever and stuff like that. Otherwise, random charts, random encounter tables are really nice to use. There's kind of a kind of a generic one in the Savage Kingdoms fourth edition book that I have right now. You know, I've written about 95% of it, so it's subject to change in the next probably 4 to 6 weeks before publication. But as it stands right now, it's just kind of a base table. GMs are free to create subtables based on the region that they're in. And if you look at the Gazetteer section of the Savage Kingdoms fourth edition book when it comes out and past ones, it'll tell you in each region kind of what denizens or what inhabitants or creatures are found there. And then you could make your own encounter tables based on that bit of information, that bit of lore. Yeah, so that way you don't have just some weird creature noted to be living in the deep forest of the north encountered on an island in the south, right? Unless you have a really good story reason behind that. So yeah, my whole point is that you can see what can happen there during the journey from Carnia to Castavar, whatever names I just made up. Actually, those are actual names in the setting. It's just one is a kingdom and one is a large town in Eredorn. But just we'll just go with the example, right? We'll just yes and improv this thing, or yes but it actually. So you can see what can happen in that 3 day theoretical journey that I gave it. And you can imagine a week's journey, what could possibly happen. And there's will probably be a day or two where nothing happens at all, and that's a good thing. That's quite realistic, if I might use that word. It's quite believable. It's quite grounded. There should be days or two of like not much happening. If you read the Lord of the Rings, these cool like things that we all know about that happen, these cool encounters, but there were many days, several days, and sometimes many days where really nothing happened except for experiencing the beautiful wildlife, that Tolkien kind of went on. Was a great writer of such things. Some people might say he was a little long-winded in some cases, and possibly so, but very, very entertaining, very poetic. He was very good at painting the picture of his world. And that brings us to another reason exploration is such a big thing in travel, because it's a kind of a way. It's a bit of a conceit. Um, it's a way to the game designer, the world builder, to kind of show off his or her world, right? Their setting through the beautiful mountains that Tolkien described, or the beautiful forest and the various marshlands and wetlands and the ocean fronts and the beach heads, the mountaintops of all these cool worlds that we come up with that are typically based on Earth with some fantasy elements. That's kind of how I do mine. I like to kind of ground it in the Earth because that way it makes the players easier to attach to kind of what's going on because it's, part of their actual real world reality. And then you layer on a few fantastical elements. That's in a nutshell. That's my trick with fantasy writing, world building, is to make it 80-90% real worlds. Going back a little bit because I do like to use a lot of actual history, particularly from the Dark Ages and before. And then you layer on your little aspects of fantasy, and that way it's a little easier for the players to digest. And it makes it kind of more real, but at the same time it makes it your world without it being actually Earth. So little, hopefully, piece of advice there in world building. Now, having said that, if you want to come up with some world or universe or that's completely different, that's totally cool as well. Just know that it will take a little more effort, and your players probably won't be able to attach into it quite as quickly because they have to learn all this new lore, right? They have to learn that, oh, there's not gravity here, or the planet is flat, or mountains don't exist here, or there's no water, or there's no desert, and or there's 67 moons and 2 suns, and that's all well and good. But remember, each kind of weird fantasy element you add, you have to kind of track that not only in your head but in whatever you write out for it, or perhaps even publish for it. And just remember the characters won't quite as quickly grab into it because it is more fantastical. Anyway, back to the normal video. Oh, I wanted to finish why I said Rangers suck, right? Just to kind of circle back to that because they don't actually. So the one way to cure that the Rangers suckage is what I just said. You have to bring out the exploration pillar of your gaming as a game master, and even as players. Players, I think, sometimes get off a little easy. No offense, because I love my players. They keep me, well, some of them keep me employed because I do some of this professionally, and others just keep me sane, and they're awesome and fellow adults in this walk of life. Um, but yeah, that's kind of why we do it, right? So, but Rangers are is if the exploration pillar, as I said earlier in the video, is embraced by the game master and the players, because they, like I said, they have to kind of buy into it, lead into it as well. Then 80 to 90% of the ranger suckage is clear. So because rangers in D&D, I'm talking Dungeons and Dragons rangers in particular, particularly 5e rangers. There's really two reasons actually. So the first one is the obvious one that I've already kind of said, but so if exploration is kind of ignored, in other words, hunting, travel between distances, it's another reason I don't like teleportation. Like, some people believe, well, you don't like teleportation because it's too high fantasy. I'm like, well, yeah, that's part of it, but you also ignore all the stuff that I've just talked about the last 23 minutes. The lovely point A to point B stuff. Now, having some teleportation and have them a way to, like, they build up to it and learn it naturally through in SK it's called instant travel. Um, they can possibly do it that way, or they find some grand legendary object that allows them to magical object allows them to do it. That's all well and good, but when it's done all the time, again, unless it fits your setting, just remember you're cutting out all that cool stuff that can happen between points. So just know if you do that, that's what happens. But yeah, so Rangers are awesome if the exploration pillar is being followed, and that's 1/3 of the game. So don't just throw it away. Like I said, all this kind of cool stuff that I just went over could happen. Um, yeah. So, and there used to be, not to bring up a first edition and second edition D&D thing, but I will because apparently I am. Rangers were the only people that could they could track. They were the only ones that could track. So this is before there was like a complete skill system. In second edition, you had what was called non-weapon proficiencies, were kind of the first skills in D&D. The first full-out skill system in Dungeons and Dragons was actually third edition, and then 3.5. And then fourth edition, I mean, still had them, but kind of like fifth edition, it was sort of like they were kind of like auto increased depending on your proficiency. I'm not knocking the system; it's a little more simplistic, but it's still there. So, but anyway, first and second edition Rangers they were the only ones that could literally track enemies, and so they were actually kind of more useful. First edition Rangers, if I recall, um, when there was an encounter about to happen, you rolled d6s, and if you rolled a 1 or 2, you were surprised. Uh, so the DM would roll a d6 for his monsters or NPCs, and the players would roll and I think it was just one player known as the caller would roll it for the whole party. And if it was a 1 or 2 on either one, they were surprised. So if the DM rolled a 2 and the players rolled a 3, then the monster was surprised, and the players got what we call now a surprise round or surprise condition. If they both were surprised, they literally were both surprised, and they kind of canceled out each other. If they both were aware, then that's where you rolled initiative to see who went first, because that's where that whole thing came from. But rangers could only be surprised on a 1 on d6, if I recall. So that was really nice, having your chances. So that alone was worth having a ranger, and being able to track creatures uh, and be a better hunter also was a really good reason. So rangers completely did not suck in first edition for sure. But I'm here to tell you, and hopefully, I'm telling you right now that they don't suck in fifth edition with some effort, as long as the uh, GM is presenting or DM is presenting wilderness encounters and travel and the opportunities to become lost based on the system that I just mentioned in SK. And you can import that system into D&D that I talked about. You can have the DR10, DC10 is a major road navigating on well, DC5 would probably be like a well-known major road. DC10 navigating on a lesser-known road. DC15 like lesser-known paths. 20, like I said earlier, with Savage Kingdoms cutting across country without a map and not really too much of a clue about what direction you're going. Um, and yeah, and if you fail by 5 or more, if you want to use the SK system, they become lost for 1d4 hours or 1d6 hours. Meaning that what that means is that they in character obviously they think they're on the right path, and it becomes clear after these number of hours that they're not no longer seeing the landmarks they were told they would see, or it becomes they run into a heavy thicket with no further path, or an avalanche that came down, and the avalanche looks like it's ancient, it's been there a while. So in other words, there was never probably a road there in the first place. So in other words, they figure out there are signs that they are lost, and that's when they can make another roll to re-navigate. But they've lost, 1d4 hours or 1d6 hours, whatever the system, whatever you want the system to be. So just something to look at. And like I said, oh, and by the way, weather can be a cool thing. I talked about random encounters and hazards, right? You can put weather. I have a separate weather chart that you roll at the beginning of the day when the characters roll the survival roll to navigate. But I'm looking at possibly weaving the weather chart into the hazards as well. It kind of is like you can run into a blizzard hazard and also like a sandstorm, but it's all very geocentric. It's all very depends on where you are. Like if you're in a desert, obviously you can have a sandstorm. Blizzard, you have to be in the far north, or at least in winter. A temperate area in like winter or something up in the mountains, maybe. But yeah, so don't forget weather. Weather's really cool, not only for description, but there are hard mechanics. I know in SK there are, like if it's raining really hard, or snowing pretty hard, you have -2 to perception skill rolls and -2 to range weaponry rolls, in other words, range attacks, and -2 to spellcasting rolls because of distractions and perhaps not being able to manipulate the wording or gestures correctly, or at least accurately. So yeah, so there are hard mechanics behind even some of the weathers, so it's not just like fluff and description. But even in fluff, as fluff and description goes, it does help your players kind of see in their mind, right? This is mostly, I know in combat and in some other action scenes we use miniatures, right? A lot of us do, at least to some degree. But the rest of the game is taking place in the mind, right? Theater of the mind. So don't short your players by not describing anything, and make sure every couple days the weather might change. Whether you're rolling actually on a chart or just kind of making it up off the fly, just make sure you kind of vary it because it does help the players imagine where they are. And like I said, there's even hard mechanics behind some of it. Some character might be like, I don't want to travel today if this weather is just terrible, because that character might have a phobia of like of thunder or lightning, or um, is a magician and doesn't want to possibly have to work magic during the horrible storm or whatever. So that could be reasons for it all, you know. And then lastly, before I end the video, you could also run into various strange creatures, which I mentioned. Strange locales could be, I think, is on my encounter chart. You could run into like weird ruins or ancient places, or like a sinkhole opens up. They fall into it, which can be dangerous itself, but then they realize it's like an ancient crypt or dungeon that they could explore. So yeah, so all this stuff can happen between these travel routes, right, or during the travel instead of just montaging them to the end. Since I just brought up travel montage, I will state this. So I would say that if the characters are traveling back and forth from a place they've been like six, seven, eight, nine, 10 times, then you could probably travel montage it and not have to roll encounters on the way necessarily. You might want to do maybe one just to keep it realistic and keep them on their toes, because you don't want them to catch on that like, oh, he's not rolling for weather and hazards and creatures because he's doing a travel montage of us going back, and we've been on this route a million times. Keep it honest, man. Let them know that the world is still kind of dangerous, and just because in game mechanics terms we're not rolling a die on a chart doesn't mean that something can't happen. Just keep them honest, right? And then the last thing would be your lore and history. So kind of going back to what I said a few minutes ago, when they're traveling, this is a chance to show off your setting and show off your history, your lore. Characters might run into some strange tree that you described. I know at SK I have a lot of like pseudo magical or semi or quasi magical herbs that they can find in the forest. So a lot of times characters skilled in herbalism will go off and hunts, and it does slow the travel rate a little bit down. So that's another thing to kind of keep in mind. If they're hunting or foraging along the way, they typically travel at half speed, which is what's called a slow pace in SK and Savage Kingdoms, and you can see like the stat. The cool thing about a slow pace is that even though they're only making like about half the mileage they would at a normal travel rate, it does give them time to they can use stealth, B they can look for herbs, and C they can like hunt or forage. So it is a benefit sometimes to go slow, especially if you're trying to hide from an enemy or you're looking for food or something. You could also do a fast pace, which gives you stamina a lot faster. I think it's 1 stamina point per hour that costs you. If you're mounted or on horseback or whatever animal, half the stamina cost goes to them, and the other half goes to the rider, which is cool. So it's only once per hour or 2 hours if it's which I think is pretty realistic because the mount's getting, or no, I'm sorry, the mount takes the full stamina, and then the rider takes half of it. Because even riding, if you've ever like ridden in real life, it can be pretty. If you don't know what you're doing, especially, it can be really taxing on your buttocks and other parts of your legs and other parts of your body. It can be just a little taxing, especially if it's through hard terrain and weather and such like that. So yeah, so travel rates, keep in mind, lore and history. They'll see your world as they travel through it. You get to explain it, get to show it off a little bit, let them interact with it, of course. And that's the point. That's the whole point, is to interact with your world. I mean, that's whenever other pillars of the game are occurring, they are interacting with the world as well. Combat, they're interacting with denizens of your world, enemies that they've made, or creatures that are just hungry and or territorial. Um, the social pillar, they're interacting for sure, like almost in a more literal sense. They're engaging in conversation or bargaining with your NPCs of your setting, whether they be friendly NPCs or hostile or indifferent, like probably most of them would actually be. So yeah. So this exploration is just another way to engage with the world, and in some ways, in a more literal sense of the world, as in the sights and sounds of nature around them and other villages and other kingdoms and tribes that may come across. So right. So in conclusion, Rangers don't suck if you use exploration. I wanted to add one little last thing to that. Game mechanically, another trick, what I did really early on, uh, with the Beastmaster Ranger, particularly the subclass of Ranger, just allow the Ranger to command his or her animal with a bonus action instead of an action. I found out that just uh, not ignoring the exploration pillar and giving them that bonus action instead of action to command your beast that alone like fixed it to me. I know the UA Unearth Arcana came out with like a sort of better ranger. I actually thought it wasn't really a need for it if you do what I just said. That remedy, but it was still pretty cool. I mean, admittedly, rangers might need maybe a 5% more boost of beyond of what the stuff I just described. But I don't think so. I think players have to know what a ranger is, and or at least what they were, and what their function is. And I think once they know that, because they're given game mechanically, they're given some pretty good martial. I mean, they're a martial caster if you want to simplify it, with a few extra little bits and bulbs here and there, right? So yeah, I think they're fine as long as the DM/GM is engaging in the exploration and travel pillar. So in conclusion, Rangers don't suck if you do if you follow a little bit of my advice there at least. And also don't ignore, especially if you're a dungeon master or a game master, do not ignore the uh, travel pillar of your game and your setting because you get to show off your world. Thing cool stuff can happen. Uh, Remember, there's no failure. There's technically not a failure in role playing games. If you fail that survival check, the survival checks I've been talking about, you still kind of win because something cool happens, right? You get lost, kind of boring, but something, right? You run into quicksand, you run into a blizzard, festering corpses or whatever. So something happens. You created story. So you really didn't fail. I mean, maybe your character was put in a more precarious position, but technically, in the grand scheme of things, you didn't fail. In fact, you created opportunity, and that's really what it's all it's about, right? Anyway, thanks for staying to the end. If you're still here, sorry that it went a little bit, maybe a few minutes longer than I wanted, but thanks again. I'll talk to you guys again soon.